Hello and welcome to this edition of TZM Global Radio. I'm your host for today, James Phillips from the UK chapter of the Zeitgeist Movement and TZM Education. Hope you're doing well out there, guys. The introduction for today's show was from a video called Imagine a School, Summerhill. And the reason I've used that introduction today is that this week myself and fellow members of the London chapter of the Zeitgeist Movement and my daughter went to visit Summerhill School, which is a democratic school set up in the 1920s by a man called A.S. Neal with a very different philosophy on what education is or what it should mean. I've done some exposés or treatments on Summerhill in past TZM education materials, but as yet hadn't actually gone to visit the school. So when a fellow member of the London chapter was setting up this particular excursion to visit the school, I leapt at the chance, and it was quite something else to actually see it in the flesh, I must say. So along with reading out some articles today from the Minds in the Making section of the TZM Education website, I'd like to just discuss some of the things that I took away from Summerhill. It was a truly profound experience. I went there with the kind of notion of, okay, I've talked this place up big time. What I want to go there to do is to find holes in it. I don't want to go there with my head in the clouds thinking, oh, I want this place to be amazing. So I went there with my skeptical hat on thinking, okay, I'm gonna try and punch some holes in this thing. And I have to say, mission not accomplished. I'm still trying to punch some holes in it, but I'm finding it very, very difficult. You see, I went there thinking, well, maybe the idea that the children don't have to go to lessons at this school if they don't want to, and that they get to decide the rules with the teachers would mean some sort of free-for-all, but nothing could be further from the truth. So what would initially jump out as being, well, this will be a complete lack of structure, actually turns up to be a more robust and mature structure than most of the adult-run educational institutions that I've encountered. For instance, one of the rules that the teacher, well, the staff, as they call them, and pupils have decided on together is that no kids are allowed to go on any game consoles or social media before 3 o'clock in the afternoon. That's not teachers setting that rule, that's kids. Which, I don't know about anybody listening to this, but it certainly surprised me, at least. The students that we met there were articulate, well-mannered, they were reasonable, they were mature, they were, above all, at least seemingly to me, happy and content. We were shown round the school with some kids just deciding to play on trampolines, and others in the workshop making something out of wood, and others doing various things around the school. It did seem to be a wholly organic and self-driven, self-motivated sort of process at the school. The children there had one of their democratic meetings, and kindly allowed us to sit in on it, and that was particularly enlightening. Some of the issues discussed were some mild altercations between a couple of the students, whereby some of the students said, I think this student wasn't being very nice to this one, and they resolved it in the most adult ways without hiding any of their feelings about it. They expressed themselves, and it was just quite something to see. I laughingly joked with someone online that if only our MPs in the UK at least could go to Summerhill and see how democracy is supposed to take place, then things might actually improve, because there wasn't a load of guffawing or anything like that, or as anyone in the UK knows, that's what goes on in Parliament, because apparently the equivalent of throwing one's feces across to the other side of the dispatch box is the best way to resolve one's differences. But none of that took place at Summerhill. It was it just common sense seemed to prevail, and it was invigorating to see. But furthermore, you might think, well, this is all well and good, but surely where you don't have to go to lessons. Some of these kids are growing up to leave school with no qualifications, and that's no good for the world they're going into. Yeah, except for the fact that students at Summerhill pass their GCSEs above the state average. So even by the state's definition of what a good education is, they surpass it. Who would have thought it, eh? Students want to learn for the sake of learning. And they're not stupid. They know the world they're going out into. They know that GCSEs are necessary to get onto the courses that they want to go on. But one of them was saying that an ex-student was commenting on the fact that when they go to college, you always know the Summerhill student because they're sitting there and many of the other students in the class may be distracted or mucking around. And they're looking at them like, why the hell are you doing that? Do you not want to actually learn? This is weird. Why would you not want to learn? So there's a very different philosophy, if you will, at Summerhill that runs around the idea that human beings are naturally inquisitive and natural learners, which runs contrary to the idea that learning is something that needs to be forced. It does if you dictate what people should learn, and you take that sort of approach, absolutely. There are many things that kids don't want to learn at the time that you decide that it's relevant for them to learn it. Now, an objection at this point usually comes in the form of, well, some kids just aren't self-motivated. Okay, which kids are you talking about? What age are they, and what education have they undergone? What's their background? What's their family environment? Who are their friends? Who are their peers? Who are their influences? There's so many different questions that come into this, but I would say that if you're discussing a 15-year-old who's been subject to coercive education for most of their life, it's not, and seems a bit lazy and lazydaxical, then it's not really that surprising, is it, that they don't want to learn quadratic equations at this particular point in their life because they don't see the relevance in it, especially when it's only being put on offer as no part of a wider context of education, rather just something that you need to learn to pass the exam at hand that the state say is the relevant education and the relevant information for you to know. And then somehow this is all such a surprise to us. I don't understand this line of reasoning. And neither does Summerhill, which is precisely why they don't usually advise taking children over the age of 11, because by then the game's already up, so to speak. They prefer to take kids younger than that, and if at all possible, though, if those children can board at the school, I think they would probably say that's preferable. There are options to just be a day attendee and go back home in the evenings. But I think the benefit of boarding at the school is realising what it's like to be part of a community. I think also the 11-12 sort of bracket was interestingly portrayed by a parent who was in the Democratic meeting, who said that through human history that sort of age of 11 or 12 is the coming of age, the child becoming into a new era of their life, one with more responsibility, with more tribal responsibility, if you will, and starting to find their feet in the adult world, so to speak. The work of John Taylor Gatto is very interesting in this regard, in that he has outlined how school is a prolonging of childhood. It stints the maturation of people, basically keeping them constantly childlike. Now, perhaps the efficacy of such a claim would be quite difficult to ascertain, but I would say, certainly from looking around at the culture around us, at the incredibly immature culture that we have around us, I think that he was probably onto something. You know, how is it that we resolve our differences? We delete ties with people. We cut off conversation. We jump to false assumptions. And false assertions, and we presume about people's intent and all these sorts of things, and we talk behind each other's back. That doesn't seem to happen at Summerhill. As I was saying, this incident they discussed, at the meeting they discussed in the open. They named the person. She said that she was sorry. She didn't realise she'd caused that much offence. She was given a strong verbal warning by the rest of the group, and she said, "Fair dues, that wasn't you know that wasn't cool, and I'll try not to do that again." Not you know, you could call it blame and punishment and all these sorts of things, but when people do engage in aberrant behaviour, or behaviour that's intolerable to those around them, then they need to be told. And you just need to stop throwing their toys out the pram about it, and deal with it maturely, like a grown-up adult should. And without jumping to the conclusion that everybody hates them for it. Essentially, you should see it as the fact that the group's actually trying to help you. And I felt that was what happened in this meeting, that there wasn't any talking behind people's backs going on. It was just dealt with in the open, and even the kids said, the bullying, they don't have to deal with it at Summerhill. They're a family, they're a tribe. Why would you bully members of your own tribe? Whereas bullying in state schools is absolutely rife. It's no wonder we've got a society of depressed adolescents, essentially. When you say, well, maybe we shouldn't be completely just plundering the planet for profit and infinite growth, they go, well, how are we going to sustain jobs? How are we going to sustain jobs? It's like, well, the jobs can get fucked. We can just do it with technology. And they go, no, you're such a dreamer. And you just think, oh my God, who am I talking to? Is this what passes for being a grown-up? Really? You're a grown-up? Jesus Christ, you must be kidding me. I think even Peter said in one of his talks, he'd probably gauged the mental age of humanity at around 9. I think he was overgenerous. I've got to be honest, Peter. Take another look, man. No, I'm kidding. I think actually he probably got that just about right. Yeah, but I think, I don't know. Maybe it is a disservice to 9-year-olds. If he came, Peter, come to Summerhill. Have a look at the 9-year-olds at Summerhill. Maybe you will actually reevaluate your estimate. This is all not to say that there aren't some negatives. I asked the girl showing us around at the school what were the downsides, and sometimes when you're being shown around a state school or something, the kids are obviously prepped to answer questions in a politician's manner, in the sense that there's nothing bad that happens at this school, everything's absolutely amazing. And my daughter said as much, who has actually shown people around her school. And they say, the teachers say, oh, please say this and say that, and make sure you do this and make sure you do that. Summerhill, they just go, well, we don't care. We, tell them the truth about the school. And the same was said in the meeting. And when I asked this girl what the downside to Summerhill was, she said, well, it's the isolation. And she was 16, about to sort of leave the school. And she said, being isolated constantly, it can be a bit boring sometimes. But she then said, but be honest, the positives greatly outweigh the negatives, and she had gone to state school, and she just said, no, I would absolutely hate to go back to that. So, but it was interesting how she just jumped straight on the negative. There was no hiding, and that was quite forthcoming. It took me aback somewhat, actually. I expected her to say, oh no, everything's flowers and daisies here. But she really didn't, and it was that sort of brutal honesty that sort of shone through from the place that just made an amazing place to be. This is, however, not the view of the British government, who tried to take the school to court in 1997 for apparently not providing an adequate education. Summerhill went to court and beat the government. Go Summerhill. So the reason being, as I said earlier, is that when you stand up there in court and you say, okay, well, what would the government's benchmark like to be for an adequate education? And they say, well, the GCSEs. And they go, okay, Summerhill's average beats the government at that, so we beat you at your own game. Why the hell are we even here? And they went, yeah, don't really know. Guess that's the court case over then. Yep, guess it is. Of course, if only that were the end of the tale. I'm sure the British government haven't completely finished trying to get their talons into Summerhill, because, as was said in the outset, in the introductory video, this philosophy of human autonomy, freedom, and the ability to grow into a self-reliant human being capable of being responsible for themselves and standing on their own 2 feet in the world doesn't really make for a very docile and obedient population to manage now, does it? The good side of the story is that it hasn't stopped Summerhill spreading around the world. So if there is one nearby you, I would recommend going and checking it out as an option if you've got children that you might want to go there, perhaps. Or perhaps even interested in setting up one of your own schools in this vein. I think that this type of notion of a natural education, if you could call it that, or an organic education, is something that can definitely help build the sort of train of thought towards what the Zeitgeist movement advocate. And even if it doesn't build that sort of world, I think a world with people who can openly discuss their ideas, such as the manner that Summerhill discuss them, would certainly advance the conversation regarding the social change greatly, because we have to remember that the people we are talking about these ideas to don't have the same backgrounds as us. They don't have the same frame of reference. They don't have the same disposition. So, if we could at least get onto an even keel with that and communicate in a more effective way with people who have a background of how to do so, then that would, I think, help this transition greatly. I think that to sum up this sort of Summerhill rant, I would probably choose the words of A.S. Neil himself, the founder of Summerhill, who said, "I would sooner have Summerhill turn out a happy dustman than a neurotic Prime Minister." And I think on that note, we'll move on. And moving on, but also with the idea of communication in mind, I'm going to now read Article 8 from the Minds in the Making section of tzmeducation.org, entitled An Effective Communicative Approach. Developing effective communication. Our current socio-economic model depends on the internalisation and promotion of a particular set of cultural and social narratives which support its continued perpetuation. This can only be challenged by changing that narrative tactfully and skillfully. The issue here is one of education and brings the question of effective communication into play. Before starting on that question, though, let us first pause to consider the good news from a cursory glance towards the corridors of history, being that the objective of building a critical mass social movement for societal change on this scale, whilst incredibly challenging and difficult, also seems entirely achievable. Something worthy of vital consideration at this point is that if you are a supporter of this direction, then before continuing on with promoting the NLRBE, the recognition that we have all grown up inside a culture whose media, system of law and general communicational methods are based upon the coercionary and communicative tactics mentioned above, will have undoubtedly had a profound impact on how we perceive the world around us and how we ourselves communicate. Can these coercive tactics be said to be effective, though? Well, in the sense that they can often achieve the desired behaviour, the answer would be yes. In the arena of advertising and marketing, for example, this is shown with truly remarkable effectiveness. However, when the underlying logic of its intentions are taken into consideration, the despotic and manipulative nature of its communicational tactics are laid bare for all to see. This is amusingly portrayed by Lee Camp in the following clip. And that is entitled Lee Camp, Advertisements Are Arseholes. Cringing and despotic as this practice may be, its efficacy is difficult to question. This is particularly well demonstrated around the consumption festival of the year, Christmas. For more information on the campaign to orientate our culture toward the supposed true spirit of Christmas, and for a more detailed analysis of the consumption promoted during the festive season, please watch the following presentation from James Phillips. That's entitled TZM Global Radio Episode 157, James Phillips Lecture Series 7 of 8, A Festive Lens for a Sustainable Economy. Given the overwhelming success, if indeed success is the proper term, of marketing and advertising, could there potentially be some worthwhile lessons for NLRBE advocates to learn from the tactics used in our own communicative approach? With the scale of the rampant consumption habits displayed by consumerism, it would be foolhardy to not at least sit up and take notes. Starting off with this short infographic on the science behind the psychology of persuasion, and that's called Science of Persuasion, that video. It's often hard to know in such a fickle, instant gratification orientated culture whether the person we are attempting to communicate with has really internalized the value and merit of what we are attempting to impart, and will go on to abstain from such aberrant behaviour in the absence of any tactics of coercion, threat of punishment, or promise of future reward. In fact, academic research in a wide variety of fields of study pertaining to this area show that once coercive or punitive measures are removed, the tendency is for subjects of such conditions to be more likely to stop taking an interest in the subject in question after these tactics have become inoperative. This issue is summed up well in the work of Alfie Kohn with the following video, which places a particular emphasis on the role of parenting techniques. And that video is entitled Unconditional Parenting, with Alfie Kohn and host Laura Markham. Cultural effects. With all of the above context taken into account, a reasonable starting position for NLRBE advocates would be an extensive evaluation of themselves, the culture in which they have grown up, and the effects this has had on shaping our personal characteristical traits, which only help to give a frank assessment of what approaches could be useful in helping to deliver the train of thought necessary for an NLRBE to come to fruition. Leading by example certainly seems to be the most common sense starting point by which to demonstrate the sort of values congruent to an NLRBE: compassion, understanding, empathy, critical thinking, collaboration, etc. in our everyday lives, actions, habits, and communicational tactics. This is a constant process of development and should be welcomed as such, with a certain humility towards admitting where we may have used poor communicational tactics in the past and how we might go about improving on these in the future. It certainly seems that the default position in our communicational methods should not be to use the tactics of blame, punishment, and aggression endemic to our current way of life if we would like to see less of these tendencies in the kind of world we would like to live in. This is easy to say in principle, but quite a bit harder to achieve in practice in a world which seems to constantly demand something from us in some way, shape or form. As always, however, the question is one of changing your personal and social environment where possible to facilitate your overall ability to impart this message in the most appropriate manner if it is to be appreciated by those in the surrounding culture. The first challenge to transition is communication. This is why patience, understanding, and a thorough inventory of the validity of our communicative methods must be the number one priority of all NLRBE advocates before embarking on any other effort to communicate what an NLRBE actually is. This is quite possibly the most difficult and critical change for all of us to make, as it involves us overriding our ego and taking a critical view of our personalities and lifestyle habits and choices to ensure that we are behaving in the most effective way possible to become the change we wish to see in the world. With this point noted, what tactics of communication would be beneficial for us to adopt in imparting an understanding and appreciation of the need to transition away from our current unsustainable set of cultural values which comprise the current zeitgeist toward a more sustainable set of social and cultural values or norms? Useful communicative methods. One method which has shown some efficacy in conflict resolution at least is nonviolent communication. By focusing on the need behind what someone may be expressing in a given conflict at a given time, it is possible to reach a resolution between people from different backgrounds. This method is summed up in the following talk by Marshall Rosenberg, and that's entitled Nonviolent Communication Workshop 1, Marshall Rosenberg. Further useful communicative methods are outlined in the following talk by James Phillips, and that is lecture 1 of the From Social Symptom to Root Cause 8-part presentation series entitled The Linguistics of Peace. The following lecture series on the subject of general semantics and the meaning of words given by Irving Lee should hopefully help to shed light on the often overlooked arena of language itself in terms of developing meaningful communication. That's Irving J. Lee. Just what is general semantics? Lecture 1 of 6. Can a direct approach work? The emphasis on peaceful and constructive dialogue should not be taken to imply that we should never be direct in what we say, but rather that a default position of an overtly aggressive approach will be far more likely to lead to the creation of a psychological barrier for those on the receiving end of such a tactic, making them psychologically predisposed to pouring scorn on our perspective from that point on, regardless of its logical validity. Personally speaking, a more direct style of communication has helped me to shift my view on certain occasions, but only when I am predisposed to considering the point of view being expressed at the time. This may not always seem to be the case, perhaps. I'm sure we can all highlight moments at which our opinion on a given subject seemed to change almost instantaneously. However, it seems highly unlikely that with your first attempt you could convince someone they are wrong in their disposition if they are emotionally and dogmatically invested in such a perspective or viewpoint. If they did make such a change because of your argument, then it would likely be because there was some other kind of underlying associative reinforcement allowing them to make such a seemingly radical and sudden shift in opinion. This point and other pertinent points are well expressed by Jacques Fresco in the following talk on communication, and that's Jacques Fresco on communication full lecture. Psychological barriers. The closed-minded reaction by many to the idea of an NLRBE may often be an irrational perspective to take, were you to assume that human beings are rational in the first place, of course. With this point properly taken into consideration, it becomes a lot easier to discern how it is that someone is unable to appreciate and adhere to clear and decisive evidence when it is put in front of them. This topic is covered in the following TED Talk by Dan Gilbert. If you type that into YouTube, you should get that. So, considering that human beings are not necessarily rational in how they arrive at conclusions, it seems that establishing empathy, remaining polite, listening and being open to considering and attempting to agree with the sentiment being expressed behind a point of view is often the most effective default position for successful communication. As the saying goes, people are interested in people who are interested in them. I personally always try my utmost to keep an open mind to criticisms of the NLRBE, recognizing that we all have blind spots and flaws. With all the effort I have put into communicating this perspective, it would be foolish for me to claim that I have no emotional investment in it. The fundamental difference with myself, I hope, is that the falsifiability inherent to the use of the scientific method to which I would like to adhere as a tool of evaluation for everyday life will hopefully enable me to shift my perspective over the course of my life, allowing me to believe in as fewer false and as many true things as possible as my life progresses. I would like to think that the NLRBE is as susceptible to this epistemology as any other theory, and is precisely why I think we need to use science in the running of global society for human concern. Human failings in decision making and the use of science to accommodate for these inadequacies is another approach that could hopefully provide useful in the effective communication of the need for the transition to an NLRBE. My personal experience of communication by NLRBE advocates. Resorting to name-calling, inciting blame and punishment, being condescending, rude, aggressive, including passively, and ill-mannered and generally not attempting to listen to the feelings and needs behind why someone is saying what they are saying or appreciating how others feel from their perspective are just some of the communicative tactics I all too often unfortunately encounter by many advocates of this direction. I appreciate that we all feel passionately about promoting this direction, and that doing so is often a lonely and frustrating pursuit. This is made especially enraging considering the needless suffering and plight being felt by many across our world unnecessarily. I'd be lying if I said that I have never resorted to some of these tactics myself, but this only reinforces the importance of the need to remain conscious of using only the most effective methods of communication possible at all times. I would be interested to see if anyone using the aggressive tactics mentioned above as a default position have actually found them to be successful communicative tools in general. From my personal perspective, whenever I've used such tactics, they have always backfired. Ultimately, the only thing that should matter in our task as a movement is what works, and for me, at least, my efforts in using this more aggressive style of communication have always been a spectacular failure and left me even more frustrated and dejected than prior to doing so. So, I attempt to ensure that I do my very best to not use them at all if I can possibly help it. My uncle once said something which encapsulates this point rather nicely for me, that being, whenever I lose my temper, I always lose. Efficiency and the low-hanging fruit. With the strategic efficiency we advocate as a movement, it is worth asking a further question when it comes to communication. Considering there are many groups out there who will be steadfast against the idea of an NLRBE, does it therefore make sense to debate these groups and individuals? This question could be addressed from multiple angles, some positive and some negative. The positive side of this sort of tactic, for example, could be that it could help to sharpen your intellectual capabilities, knowledge and understanding of the many subjects which comprise an NLRBE. If this debate takes place publicly, then it may also help to highlight certain unconsidered perspectives for those in attendance. However, it might also transpire that many of the attendees may not change their opinion due to confirmation bias regardless of what's presented. The downside is that debate is to create hostility and stalemate rather than providing the optimal method for reaching a valid conclusion. Debate is a competitive and combative form of communication with the primary interest to win rather than use the collaborative process of discussion to decipher a closer approximation of the truth. My conclusion would be that a far better, effective and more strategically efficient use of our time in advocating this direction would be to instead focus on communicating with like-minded groups. This is what I would refer to as the low-hanging fruit approach. This is precisely why TZM education exists. My hypothesis when starting this project in 2010 was that children would be far more likely to be able to appreciate this message of a brighter future than adults would. After many visits to schools with children of varying ages, I can confirm that the response I get tends to be very positive indeed. In fact, the only negative response I received when I gave a more aggressive presentation to a group of older students at a secondary school, around 17 to 18 years old. Further cementing the overall perspective that friendly communication and dialogue is far more likely to establish a meaningful connection and reaction, leaving the door open for future consideration by all in attendance. As mentioned earlier, this is not the only approach that could be undertaken, but considering the enormous amount of time I see many advocates of this direction spending on debating those who will more than likely never be able to appreciate what it is they are trying to convey, and with so many other more positive alternative avenues available to explore, the communication practices laid out in this article must become a major part of our overall strategy if we are to start to make any significant headway in moving the current cultural zeitgeist forward in a positive direction. So please do take the time to visit the Action in Education section of this site and join in this global initiative to go into your local schools and universities to communicate these ideas to future generations. And that concludes the reading of this article. But the next one will be featured on my next radio show, entitled Riding a Trojan Horse to an NLRBE. Before concluding today's show, I'd like to return just briefly to the subject of Summerhill and convey the deep sense of injustice that both myself and my girlfriend Sarah and partner in TZM Education felt coming away from that school, that we'd been robbed of a truly decent introduction, if you will, or organic introduction to learning that Summerhill provides. And we were sort of discussing what type of people we might be had we undergone that kind of childhood experience as opposed to the one that we have undergone. There's obviously no way of returning the clock, so that we'll never know. But undoubtedly we'd be very, very different people. And it's in that sense that you can't help but look at the way our culture is actually talking to kids about what learning is, and just feel an incredible sense of sadness that this is the position that we've arrived at. That thinking that being awestruck by this amazing reality that we all share, this mind-boggling reality, and wanting to know more about it incessantly is somehow a boring thing. I just don't know how we've got to that crazy situation, where we think such a thing actually has to be forced. It does baffle the mind. So as if there could be as if there could still be some sort of debate about whether education should be forced or not, or what it is actually for. What I would like to leave you with is some words of another great educational reform activist, I suppose you could call him, and writer and speaker, who I've looked up to over the years. Give a brief outline on his view of what education in the current zeitgeist is for. I hope that you feel, as I do, that by being a part of this movement, that we are planting the seeds of a change in such a zeitgeist. But I'll leave you with the words of Alfie Kohn. Thanks for listening to me today, guys. Take care of yourselves, and I'll speak to you soon. Cheers. Bye-bye.